Hi everyone. So in today's lecture, we are going to be looking at air, right? And in the context, again, of factors that affect plant growth and development. But first, we are going to review. So in last lecture, we talked about water as it relates to plant growth and development. And we started by looking at some aspects of water, right? And we said that water or water molecule has polarity. Thus, it has different charges on different ends of the molecule, like a magnet, right? So one end is more negatively charged, the other end is more positively charged. And that results in some unique properties, cohesion and adhesion. So cohesion is our water molecules are attracted to each other. They form these hydrogen bonds, right? Very similar to like a magnet, right? The negative end is attracted to the positive end. Adhesion is that these water molecules are attracted to other molecules, right? Not just themselves. Other properties or things that affect water movement include gravity, positive pressure. So think of like the pressure that's exerted when water's moving through a hose, as well as negative pressure, which think of sucking in water from a straw, right? You're creating a vacuum and that's sucking water up. And osmosis. And osmosis is really this process where water is going to want to flow to the more salty area, right? So if you have a permeable membrane where water is able to flow back and forth, if there is a salty environment on one side and a less salty on the other, water is going to move towards that salty area. That's osmosis. So all of those things affect water movement. And we can lump all these things together and create what is called water potential. And essentially, water is going to move from high to low water potential, right? And that water potential is determined by those properties that we just talked about. So then how does water get into our plants or get into the root and then move through the plant? Well, water gets into the root through the root hairs, and it's going to utilize osmosis. And what is happening is that our plant is pumping in mineral ions that it needs for nutrients. And it uses energy to do this. This is active transport. So it uses energy and it gets nutrients into our root. And those ions create a salty environment. And again, through that process of osmosis, water is going to want to flow towards that salty environment. So water then flows into our root through osmosis. It's one of the reasons why over fertilizing can be so bad, because it creates that salty environment outside of the root, and water can actually flow out of the root as well, or prevent water from flowing in. So water flows in through this osmosis process. Some positive pressure starts pushing it up the xylem. Remember, the xylem is the vascular tissue that transports water. So there's some positive pressure, but most of the way that water is going to move through the plant is due to this transpiration stream. So transpiration is the evaporation of water from our plant's leaves, right? And it leads through the stomata, which are those pores, particularly on the underside of our leaves, that when they open, they allow for gas to exchange, oxygen and carbon dioxide to exchange in our leaves. But when they're open, they also allow for water to evaporate, and that's called transpiration. So when water evaporates, it dries out the cells in that area right where it began evaporating. And then water in the wet cells adjacent to that begin diffusing into those dry cells. And that process repeats all the way down the plant, up down to the roots, and it creates this stream that ultimately is going to transport water throughout the plant, right? And that is this transpiration stream. And that is how water moves through your plant. It's dependent on the evaporation of water from the leaves, which is referred to as transpiration. Now, the availability of water in the soil is affected by soil texture. And we said our soil could be made up of different sized particles, sand being largest, silt kind of in the middle, and clay being smallest. And the size of particles is going to influence your pore space, right? The area between those particles, with bigger particles having bigger pore spaces and smaller particles having smaller pore spaces. And the bigger the pore space, the more likely water is going to flow through it, right? So bigger particles lead to bigger pore spaces and less water holding ability. Your sandy soil holds less water than a clay soil that has small particles, small pore spaces, and a lot of water holding ability. So that was a little bit about the properties of water, how water gets into a plant and then moves through a plant, the availability of water in the soil. And the last thing we looked at is how water will affect growth and development in some particular ways. And we said that water is the first step needed for germination. So it's critical for germination, right? The seed imbibes water, it takes in water. Without that, germination is not going to start. So it's critical for germination. Water also plays a role in structural support, particularly for our herbaceous plants, right? You might have forgotten to water a plant for a while and it begins to wilt. That is due to turgor pressure. So if you remember from plant cells, they have that large central vacuole, and that vacuole, when it's filled with water, it exerts pressure on the cell membrane that pushes up against the cell wall, and it keeps your plant rigid, right? It provides structure. If there is not enough water, the pressure, that vacuole shrinks and it doesn't exert pressure, and your plant can begin to wilt. Now, what also happens is when that's occurring, your cell walls kind of try to make up for that, and they become thicker, right? And we can take advantage of that again if we're trying to manipulate our plants in a certain way and maybe make them smaller, right? And one way we can do that is to withhold water at certain points while they are growing. That's referred to as drying down. But it's you have to be careful with it, right? Because water is critical. Without water, your plants can ultimately die, or you can do a lot of damage. So if you're careful with it, it's another way where we can then make smaller plants, right? This drying down process. Now, water is also needed for our mineral and metabolite transport. So in order for those nutrients to get up to where they need to be in the tissues in the plant, it's going to need water through our xylem. And it's also needed for metabolite transport. So this is both glucose and the other molecules or the other compounds that are made from glucose during these different metabolic processes are traveling through the phloem, and we need water for that process as well. And lastly, water is critical for photosynthesis, right? For photosynthesis, we need carbon dioxide, water, and photons or light. So water is needed for that process of photosynthesis. And again, going back to the thesis of this entire section, any factor that affects photosynthesis will affect plant growth. Now, in terms of how much water is needed for our plants, it is plant specific, and we do need more studies that quantify that actual need. And it's something that you guys can do yourselves. And we looked at a couple different methods, both more advanced methods that utilize some more advanced technology and soil moisture meters, as well as some less advanced methods where you just need a scale and keep track of water that way. So that is it. Let us get on now with the lecture. So if we return to the 9 cardinal parameters that we looked at when we first started looking at some of the environmental factors that affect plant growth and development. Again, this was developed by Bruce Bugbee from Utah State University. If we look at them, we see that we've addressed in our series of lectures here a number of them. We've looked at light, we've looked at temperature, and we've looked at water. And in this lecture, we're going to be looking at 4 more factors. Oxygen, particularly oxygen in the root zone or rhizosphere, carbon dioxide, and then wind and humidity. We're going to start with oxygen. Now, oxygen is very important because it's required for aerobic cellular respiration. And this is the main process by which our plants or cells or even your cells get energy, right? In this process, our cells take the glucose molecule, and in our plants, it's that glucose molecule that was produced by photosynthesis. And they take that glucose molecule and they use oxygen to create 38 ATP, or a maximum of 38 ATP. And ATP is just the energy currency of the cell, right? So you can just think of it as creating energy, like a chemical energy, right? So they're breaking down that sugar molecule, and they're using oxygen, and they're getting energy, or they're creating energy from that. And then they're producing carbon dioxide and water as byproducts. So because this is the way or the main mechanism by which our plant cells are creating energy, any plant process that requires energy is going to then require oxygen, right? Because it needs to go through this process. So oxygen is then essential for a lot of metabolic pathways that occur in our plants, right? The production of different metabolites. And it's also important for the active transport of nutrients into plant roots. In the next lecture, we're going to get on nutrition and mineral elements. And in order for them, and I think I mentioned it a little bit in the talk on water when we talked about osmosis, But in order for our mineral elements to get into the plant roots, they get there through active transport, which requires energy, right? So we need oxygen. We're going to need the production of ATP, or the production of energy, to get these nutrients into our plants, right? So it's very, very important that our plant roots have energy, and thus there's oxygen in our root zone. So low oxygen will limit nutrient absorption, obviously, that I just talked about. It will decrease root growth or lead to root death, which can result in water stress, reduced photosynthesis, and reduced growth or yield, right? Anything that's going to affect photosynthesis is going to affect the growth of your plants, or the ultimate yield of your plants or crop that you're growing, right? And in this case, if we have low oxygen, most of the time that low oxygen is going to occur in the root zone. It's going to impact your roots, thus impacting the ability for them to get nutrients and water, impacting photosynthesis, and thus decreasing growth or yield. So how do plants get oxygen, right? How does oxygen enter a plant, right? We just talked about how it's important for our plant cells, for that process of aerobic respiration. How does it actually get into the plant? Well, in our leaves and in our stems, at least for our herbaceous stems, oxygen is entering through stoma or stomata, right? And again, we've talked about them before. Those are those pores. If we're talking about leaves, they're often found on the underside of leaves. And it's through them, and they have guard cells, and they're able to open and close, and it's through them that gas exchange occurs. And you can see them in our image right here. Now, hold on, in case you can't see that, let me put it on the red here. Right, so here would be a cross section of a leaf, and right here is our stoma, right? And it's through this opening that oxygen and carbon dioxide is going to enter our plant. In this case, enter the leaf of our plant. Now, in our woody plants, in the woody stems, they may not have a stoma or stomata, but they have what are called lenticels, right? And if you've seen them, I'm sure you've seen them. These are common in cherry trees, but they are openings in the bark tissue or the outer cork through which air is able to get into our stem tissue. Now, if we're talking about roots, the main pathway is through the root hairs, right? The same pathway that water goes through and minerals along with them. Now, a critical point is that there is no gas transport system within plants. There is not a system within our plants that moves oxygen from one part of the plant to another part of the plant, right? You have a circulatory system, right, where your blood is transporting oxygen. But in plants, they do not have that. Their vascular system is just transporting water, or as well as minerals and some metabolites, right, through that xylem and that phloem. But it does not transport oxygen. And because of that, plants need to take in oxygen near where they need it, right? It's difficult for a plant to take in oxygen from the leaf and have that oxygen travel down to the root system, right? Because there's no transport system. The only way it's getting there is traveling through intercellular spaces as it slowly diffuses through the plant, right? So it's limited in terms of where that oxygen is taken in. It's limited into the extent in which it will flow through the plant. Now, there are some specialized tissues called parenchyma that help move air through a plant, and you will find these in wetland plants where often your oxygen is limited in the root zone, right? And these parenchyma tissue, they're essentially spongy parenchyma tissues, right? Remember those parenchyma, those all-around cells, right? It's a type of parenchyma tissue that's very, very spongy, and it creates air channels to allow for the better exchange of gases between the shoot and the root, right? We're going to see that water or waterlogged soil is one of the main factors that prevents or decreases the amount of air in your soil. Thus, if you're in a wetland plant where the soil is often waterlogged or the plant may be partially underwater or covered in water, this parenchyma tissue is going to help some of that oxygen that the plant is able to get from the atmosphere travel into the root system. So I kind of mentioned oxygen in the atmosphere, right? What is the availability of oxygen? Well, our atmosphere is about 21% oxygen. And because of that, deficiencies, or at least oxygen deficiencies in stem or leaf tissue, it's very, very rare, right? There is enough oxygen in the atmosphere for our plants to be able to do all the cellular respiration that they need. And they're able to easily acquire it through those stomata or lenticels. But the problem, or the oxygen issues, occur in the rhizosphere, which is just the area of the soil that is in the vicinity of our roots, right? And there's root interactions in that area, right? So in our soil is where we are going to see our oxygen deficiencies, right? It's most common. And now the amount of oxygen in soil is going to be determined by a couple of things: the soil texture, as well as soil saturation, or how much water is saturated in that soil. And then compaction also plays a role, or can play a role as well. Now, there's also oxygen in water, dissolved oxygen in water. And as sometimes our plants naturally grow in water, our wetland plants or submerged aquatic vegetation, or sometimes we grow our plants in water, like we're doing in the hydroponic setup that we have. And then our plants are able to access oxygen out of water, and the amount of oxygen that's found in that water is going to be determined by temperature and salinity, as well as a couple other things, but those are some of the main ones. So if we're looking at soils then, and the factors that affect oxygen availability in our soils, one of the big ones is soil texture. Now, why is this? So similarly to as we talked about when we looked at plant or water and water availability in the soil, right? Our soil is made up of different sized soil particles. And it's the size of these particles that are going to impact the size of the spaces between them, right? With larger particles having larger pore spaces and smaller particles having smaller pore spaces. Well, if you have a large particle with those large spaces, the water in there is going to drain through that soil fairly quickly, right? And if you think about our sandy soil that we have here on campus, that's relatively large particles compared to silt or clay. And you can see in the image up there the relative size of them. So with those large pore spaces, water's going to drain through. Our sandy soil doesn't hold water very well. And in those spaces, those empty pore spaces, right, that is where your air is going to flow into, right? And again, our air is about 21% oxygen. So by having those open spaces, that is where you are going to have your air, and then your plants are able to access that, right? And if we look at, or if we compare our different grain sizes or different types of soil, we see that at field capacity. So that is a term that means if our soil is completely saturated and we let some of it drain out, so it's as filled with water as it can be. In our sandy soils, air is going to occupy about 25% of the volume, right? So even with all that water filled in our sandy soils, there's still going to be about 25% by volume of air in those soils. But if we look at some of our clay soils, we see that drops by about 10 to 15%, right? So a big difference in the amount of air that is found based on our soil texture size. Now, compaction also plays a role in this, right? And compaction, essentially what compaction does is that it reduces the pore space, and that displaces the air. Again, in those pore spaces, that's where you're going to find your air or your oxygen. So if you compact those pore spaces, you're gonna reduce or eliminate that area where you could find oxygen, right? And compaction could be a problem in some of our farm fields where you have heavy equipment or tractors that are traveling over that area repeatedly. More of your smaller grain soils, so your clay soils, are more prone to some of that compaction. But we can also see it in growing our plants in containers, right? In container growing, compaction often occurs in the interior of that container. And as a result, your plant roots tend to develop at the bottom or the sides of the container where there's that gap. And that gap is where you're going to get your air, right? And you can see, I'm sure you've all picked up a plant out of container and you see all the roots on the side, right? There's a tendency to get root bound if you let them grow too much. But one of the reasons why there's that buildup of the roots around that area is because that is where you're going to find your oxygen, right? Because there's going to often a gap in that area between the side walls of your container and your potting mix, and the interior gets too compacted and there's not good oxygen or pore spaces for oxygen in the interior. Now, besides soil texture, the amount of water in your soil or your soil saturation is going to impact the availability of oxygen, right? Because we just talked about it. That water in your soil is going to displace the oxygen in those pore spaces. And as a result, overwatering in the case of if we are growing our plants, right, or overwatering in the case of flooding of soils in like a wetland environment, unless our plants are adapted to it, can lead to decreased root growth or root death, right, in something we call root rot. Right? And this occurs in kind of two ways, or there's two things that are happening, right? First off is that water in that soil is creating a hypoxic, which just means low oxygen, or even anoxic, which means basically no oxygen condition, right? And if there's not enough oxygen, as we talked about, there's not going to be enough energy to carry out all the metabolic processes that are needed. There's not going to be enough energy to pump in these mineral ions into our plant. Ultimately, your roots are going to stop growing and they're going to die. What also happens is that when there's no oxygen, they switch to anaerobic respiration. Now, this is much less efficient. In aerobic respiration, where we have oxygen, that process produces around 38 ATP, like I talked about. In anaerobic respiration, it's only producing 2, right? So you're getting much less energy through this, and you're getting the creation of byproducts. In the terms of, with our plants, is often ethanol that is being produced. Now that byproduct, that ethanol, starts attracting, it gets released from our roots in what is called a root exudate. And that starts attracting or can attract pathogens that can now start attacking your roots, especially as your roots start dying, right? It's an access way for pathogens to now enter your plant. And those conditions, those wet conditions, are often more conducive to fungal growth that again can act as pathogens, ultimately leading to the death of your roots. Now you can see root rot. Your roots should normally be a nice white color, right? They may be stained a little bit by the soil, but they should generally look somewhat white, right? And they're often, you can see the root hairs, right? And nice and branchy. In root rot, now you can't see it too well here, but you can see they get very, very dark and black or brown, right? And they do not look healthy. And that is a sign of overwatering and this root rot that can be occurring. Now, if we are growing in our plants in a hydroponic environment, or even if our plants are in more of a wetland environment, they can absorb oxygen that is found in the water. And we refer to that as dissolved oxygen, right? That's the oxygen that's dissolved in our water. Now, the amount of dissolved oxygen varies with temperature and salinity. And essentially, with higher temperatures and higher salinity, you're going to find lower dissolved oxygen. And you could see it in our two graphs that we have here, right? You see as your temperature increases, you see lower dissolved oxygen, it decreases. Same with salinity, right? As salinity increases, dissolved oxygen decreases. Right, so our wetland plants, especially our salt marsh plants, have adaptations to this, right? That parenchyma tissue that we talked about. But if we are growing in a greenhouse environment, this is something, and especially in a hydroponic environment, it's something we need to be aware of, right? We often have to have in place some form or some way of mixing oxygen with water to increase dissolved oxygen in our hydroponic setup, right? For what we're doing with our deep water culture, we have a bubbler that you would find with like fish tank. That's what we're utilizing. That's working fine. But there are also other methods that you can utilize or other ways of mixing in oxygen with your water. A lot of times, as long as you are flowing that water and kind of disturbing it a little bit, it's enough to mix oxygen in. But there are also methods in which you can incorporate ozone and hydrogen peroxide. Both of those break down into oxygen. So there are methods where they utilize those as well, and they set them in tanks, and it breaks down to oxygen, and they can incorporate that into their irrigation system as well. So that is oxygen, right? Important for our root growth primarily. It's limited. Where you're going to find it is going to be limited in the root zone or the rhizosphere. It affects our root growth. It affects our root survival. And with low oxygen, ultimately we'll have root death and we'll have plant death, right? And it affects our yields as well. I don't have a slide in there as well, but again, it's going to affect photosynthesis, and anything that affects photosynthesis affects plant growth and affects plant yield. Now we're going to talk about carbon dioxide, right? So the oxygen was important for cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is needed for photosynthesis. And that is the process by which we're taking that carbon dioxide or that carbon from the air and we are fixing it. We are turning it into a sugar molecule. Right? We just saw respiration where we break that sugar molecule down to create energy. This is the process whereby we create that sugar molecule, right? So this is the process by which we are starting our food chain, right? We're taking energy from the sun to create food, or at least our plants are, right? Now, carbon dioxide occurs in much less quantities than oxygen. Oxygen was about 21% of our atmosphere. Carbon dioxide right now is around 0.4% of our atmosphere. Much less, around 400 parts per million. Now, this has changed through time, right? And especially over the past, really since the Industrial Revolution, since we started burning fossil fuels, our level of carbon dioxide has drastically increased. So if you see here in the chart, this is around the past 800,000 years ago. And we had a pretty steady cycle of rising and falling carbon dioxide levels. This was related to these are called Milankovitch cycles. This was related to the wobble and tilt of the Earth and then these feedback mechanisms. We don't need to get into it. But again, for the past 800,000 years, we've had these rising and falling of carbon dioxide levels. And then, but they stayed around really, anywhere from 180 parts per million to around almost 300, but below it. And then with the start of the Industrial Revolution, they shot up to where they are now, which is actually a little bit above 400 parts per million, which is much higher than it has been in the past 800,000 years. So how does this affect plants? Again, if carbon dioxide is needed for photosynthesis, anything that's going to affect photosynthesis is ultimately going to affect plant growth and yield, right? That's our common theme throughout this entire thing. So what we see is that carbon dioxide, there is a positive effect, right? It increases plant growth. Now, this effect is greater with your C3 plants as opposed to your C4 or CAM. We'll learn about this at the end of the lecture. They are different ways or different processes of photosynthesis. But the thing to know is that your C3 plants, which are your more common plants, there's an inefficiency in them which is referred to as photorespiration. And what this means is that sometimes in that process, right, normally our plant is taking that carbon dioxide and it's turning it into a sugar molecule, glucose. But sometimes in that process, when oxygen is present, it actually fixes an oxygen molecule instead of a carbon dioxide molecule. And that is called photorespiration. And what happens is it winds up using ATP and nothing gets produced, or not your glucose does not get produced. So it's actually this inefficiency that occurs, right? And by increasing carbon dioxide levels, you actually reduce that photorespiration. So you have more photosynthesis that's occurring. And again, more photosynthesis, you get better yields or better plant growth. And we've seen this both in the natural environment, where we've seen increases in carbon dioxide, and in experiments done in greenhouses. So this graph over here is data collected from about 60 publications that look at increases in CO2 concentration and their effect on greenhouse crops. And you can see that as that increases, we generally see an increase in relative growth. And that is compared to, I think, around 340 parts per million, right? So you see an increase here as you increase CO2 concentrations. Although it begins to level off at a certain point, right? And this variation here is due to the variation that you see in different crops, right? Because not every crop is going to respond the same way. But in general, the more CO2, the more plant growth you see, right? And we've also seen this in the wild, right? Not just in our greenhouse studies, but in studies that they've looked at tree productivity over the past several years. You see an increase by 23%. I don't include it in the slide, but a study that looked at ways of measuring carbon and measuring carbon historically is finding that our plants are utilizing about 30% more carbon dioxide, or taking in about 30% more carbon dioxide uh, now than they did in the past, right? Due to these higher carbon dioxide levels. And we've seen that in our, not just in our greenhouse plants or our natural plants or wild plants, but also in some of our plants that we would refer to as agronomy, like those plants that are you'll see in our large farm fields, right? Produced in large quantities, staples of the human diet, wheat, corn, etc. They are also responding to these increased levels in carbon dioxide. And we see boosts in productivity of wheat by about 11.5% and corn by about 8.4%. But it's not all good news, right? Whereas carbon dioxide and that carbon dioxide fertilization is going to increase plant growth, it also reduces the nutritional content of our plants. So you're getting more plant growth, but the nutritional content of your plants are lower, right? One of the reasons why this is happening is that with that lower photo respiration rate, right? And I just talked about that, how they're fixing oxygen sometimes instead of carbon dioxide, it makes your plants less stressed. And the problem with your plants being less stressed is that they stop producing chemicals that respond to stress, right? So stressed plants produce more antioxidants, such as vitamin C and E, and they also produce more protein, right? And ultimately, they produce more components that are give them a higher nutritional value, right? That stress is actually a good thing in terms of nutritional value. It's very similar to think about exercise with you guys, right? With humans, right? That stress causes the adaptation that makes you healthier. Ultimately, the stress in our plants causes the production of these various compounds that increase the nutritional quality of our plants. So actually, by adding more carbon dioxide, we may be getting better plant growth, but we're decreasing the nutritional content. Another factor that we need to consider, especially if we're talking about in relation to climate change, right? We are pumping carbon dioxide and carbon into the atmosphere, and we are driving climate change now. And whereas that carbon dioxide may have that a little bit of benefit or have that benefit in terms of plant growth, we need to think about that in terms of the other limiting factors that also affect plant growth, right? Because CO2 enrichment is only going to have an effect as long as there are no other limiting factors. And as we looked at, right, there are a lot of other limiting factors: sunlight, water availability, nutrient availability, etc. In terms of climate change, that CO2, right, may have the positive effect on the initial plant growth, but it's also going to change our climate and it's going to change our water availability, right? One of the impacts of that is going to be more frequent droughts, hotter weather. So the benefits that you may get in plant growth are likely going to be offset by the temperatures that we see in a lot of regions that are leading to water stress. So you won't necessarily see these benefits, right, that you might just expect in a greenhouse when you just pump up carbon dioxide. So it's important to think of all of this in terms of a system, right? And there's all these multiple effects that are impacting your plants, right? And while as increased carbon dioxide does have a positive effect, it has to be thought of in relation to all these other effects as well. These things that we talked about: temperature, light, water availability, etc. So we're going to end by looking at humidity and wind and their effects on our plant growth as well. So if we're talking about humidity, relative humidity is the ratio of water vapor in the air to the amount of water vapor it could hold based on the temperature and atmospheric pressure, right? So about, if we had like 75% humidity, that means that, say, we could hold the air could hold 4 kilograms of water, and it's currently holding 3 kilograms, right? You would divide 3 by 4, and that's 75%, right? So it's holding 75% of the maximum amount of water that it could hold in the air. Now, the difference in relative humidity inside the leaf versus outside of the leaf affects the transpiration rate. And that's one of the big things that humidity does. It affects transpiration rate. So inside the leaf, you're often at around 100% relative humidity. Outside the leaf is going to be whatever the humidity is of your environment. And the smaller the difference between those two, the slower your rate of transpiration. Now, this could be a good thing in some instances, right? If you have slow transpiration rate, you are not going to utilize, or your plant isn't utilizing as much water, right? Or doesn't, because as it's transpiring, right, it needs more water from the soil, so it's able to conserve water. This is particularly important when you are looking at if you're doing propagation with cuttings, right, because they haven't established a root system yet. That's why when you do any sort of cuttings, you often have a nice humidity dome that you create. You often put them in darkness as well, right, because you want no photosynthesis, you want no transpiration occur. So you keep it very, very high humidity until that root system can develop. So, and again, just like we've seen with all these other environmental factors that we've looked at, temperature, water, etc. There's a range, which is a good range that is ideal for your plant growth. And if you go to the extremes, you start getting into some negatives and some disadvantages, right? So if your transpiration rate is too high, so if you have this large difference between your humidity in your leaf and your humidity outside, right? So if it's very not humid at all, you're going to have a higher transpiration rate, and that could lead to too much water loss. And if you get too much water loss, your stomata are then going to close to protect, try and conserve as much water as possible. If your stomata close, there's no more flow of nutrients into your plant because the nutrients are coming in through that transpiration stream. There's no photosynthesis that's occurring, right? Because water is needed for photosynthesis, so that's not going to occur. And ultimately, your plant is going to stop growing, or you're going to get decreased growth, and your plant, if that occurs for a long enough time, your plant is going to die, right? So a low amount of humidity or no humidity is going to tax your plant. But if you get too much humidity and thus your transpiration rate is too low, now you have too slow of a flow of water, so not enough water is coming in, so not enough photosynthesis occurring, and again, you have your decreased growth of your plant, right? And decreased uptake of nutrients ultimately could lead to plant death, right? There are also humidity-related diseases, right? Mildews and mold, which are fungi, various fungi that thrive in higher humidity conditions. Certain bacteria thrive in higher humidity conditions that can impact or affect your plants. So the ideal humidity for most plants is around 50 to 60% relative humidity, although this is going to vary by species, right? Some plants, maybe your tropical plants, do better with a higher humidity. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, your desert plants do well with a much lower amount of humidity, right? So it varies by plant species and also varies a little bit by life stage, right? With the younger plants doing a little bit better with higher humidity. And as you get into that reproductive stage, you don't necessarily, or you might do better with a little bit less humidity as well. And the last thing we're going to talk about is wind. So wind can also impact your plants in a number of ways, right? Some of the benefits is your wind is going to disperse pollen, right? So we're talking about reproduction of our plants, of our wild plants, of our plants grown in fields, right? Our agronomy or agronomic, if that is a word, plants, right? So your grasses are wind dispersed, pines, oaks, right? In the springtime, I'm sure you, especially around where we live, your cars and you see everything gets covered in pollen, that pine pollen in particular, and oak pollen, right? It's very common. So wind disperses pollen, so it's going to aid in reproduction for certain plants. It disperses seeds, right? Now, a lot of our seeds have adaptations for dispersal or for wind dispersal. Dandelions, cattails, those fluffy seeds, right? Maples, sure, these are called samaras, right? We used to call them helicopters because you helicopter down when you drop them, right? These are adaptations that aid in dispersal by wind. Now, wind also has an effect on plant growth, especially with your seedlings. It creates stronger stems in your seedlings. So every time a plant is pushed by the wind, it releases auxin, a plant hormone that stimulates growth, right? We've looked at auxin with phototropism, right? It stimulates cell elongation. It also stimulates cell growth. And what happens is that wind is pushing those plants is going to stimulate cell growth of these supporting cells that aid or create a stronger stem. It's why you may want some wind in your greenhouse, or even if you're in your greenhouse when you're looking at your plants, run your fingers along them, right? Push them from side to side. That is gonna aid and create stronger stems in these seedlings that ultimately make them healthier plants. Now, again, we can go to the extremes, right? Too much wind can damage our plants, right? You've all seen uh, outside after a particularly strong storm, right? Trees knocked down, branches knocked down, etc. So too much wind can be a problem. Wind also increases transpiration and transpiration rate, right? So what's happening, as we kind of talked about, when those stomata open, the water vapor or water is rushing out, right? Because we have a high humidity in our leaf and a lower humidity outside. And it rushes out and it kind of creates this bubble right around those stomata of humidity. And the wind is going to blow that bubble away, and now more water is going to rush out, and the wind keeps blowing that bubble away. So wind is actually ultimately increases the transpiration rate. Now, that could be a good thing in some instances, right? Because you're getting more water to flow through and maybe more nutrients. But if it's too much, it becomes an issue, especially on our hot days or our hot, low humidity days in the summer. Uh, they can really increase transpiration rate and result in water stress of your plants relatively easily. So that is it for this lecture. I hope you guys enjoyed.